Hello and welcome to Assetify for Blender. It is finally time. It has been released. I've been working on this for quite some time and now it's here. So Assetify for Blender is a tool, an add-on that really processes, bakes and exports anything you throw at it, right? Whether it's going to be one object or 200, or if it's going to be geometry node based, or if it's going to be procedural materials, particle systems, pretty much anything, right? So the aim is to reduce some repetitive steps or some struggling steps, some annoying parts of your Blender workflow, and to just process that in a few minutes with a few clicks, right? So that is really what Assetify is for. The links are in the descriptions. It's a Gumroad and a Blender Market link. You can get them from both, depending on what you prefer. Now, please, if you do get it, leave me a bit of feedback, right? Assetify is still in its baby shoes. I want to add a lot of stuff. I want to improve things. And the only way I can do that is by getting some feedback from you guys. So please keep that in mind. So let's dive into Assetify. Let's press N to open up Assetify. And I'm just going to collapse everything real quick to show how you will start off, right? So this is what it would look like. And well, this is Assetify, right? So we work from top to bottom. And what it does is it processes assets or collections, it bakes and it exports, right? So for your processing, we start at the top, your asset collections. That will always be unfolded, and because it's the most important part where your list is and your asset collections. So to add things to the Assetify systems so that you can actually process, bake, export, whatever you want to do with the Assetify. If you want to enter an object or a collection to the system, you need to use the asset collections, right? So you can hit plus and you can set a collection, for example, the Volkswagen Kombi here, which is, let me hide this. This is the Volkswagen Kombi, quite a nice car. We can actually then add this to the system and all of its objects that are used to build this Volkswagen. We can now just process these assets, and it is going to process all of the objects, and processing means it's going to get them ready to bake and export later. Now there's two options that you can check or uncheck. Now the first one is enable custom attributes. I'm going to leave that for now. We'll get back later. And the other one is disable original collections, right? I don't want to change, tweak, alter any one of your original models, which means that when we process, it's going to duplicate your collection and it's going to process that. And when that happens, they are going to be overlapping. So this button takes care of hiding the original one. It will still be there, but not visible. So we can actually just keep that checked, process our Volkswagen Kombi, and it will pop up a window. If you have unsaved changes, it allows you to save, because I don't want you to lose any unsaved progress, right? In Blender, it happened too much to me, so I don't want you to go through the same. So before processing, before baking, if you have unsaved changes, you will get this pop-up every single time. I think that is for the better. Save and proceed. There we go. They are now added to your system, right? And that means they will have a list entry as well. This is where your entire information of Assetify will be, right? You have an asset tab and a collection tab. The collection is the topmost collection that you added to the system, which means that even if you have sub collections here, they will not be shown in your collection list here, just the collection that you actually set in here, right? For organization. The actual assets will be set in your asset tab there. Now you can do all the baking, the exporting, for individual assets, right? Or you can do it for an entire group, an entire collection for ease of use, right? Just like that. So every list entry has a checkbox in front and icons next to it. The checkbox in front basically means you're going to include it in one of the processes, right? Include or exclude. Include, and you can delete, separate, join, swap. You can bake this way. If you uncheck this, the bake also grays out, and same for export, right? So this is where you include or exclude actual assets and collections to the processes. So if you check this, the icons behind it give you some information about the status. The first one is the swap status, and swapping is the bottom button. There's also a little info here in case you forget my quick little info here in the tutorial. It swaps your original and your game assets. right? So the game assets are what is actually processed here. I call them game assets because they are ready to be exported for games, I suppose. And when you swap them, they will just swap the assets between the collections, right? I can swap them right now and you can tell what is happening, right? It will just swap them. And this is going to be useful when you are processing particles, for example, that are used in a scatter system, right? You can actually bake your particles, swap them around to their original collections, and then bake the entire emitter, right? That is just going to make sure that you can bake your particles, swap them without actually having to manually change collections whatsoever, right? It's just a little bit of ease of use, I suppose. Then the next one is the texture bake icon, right? Whether or not textures of that collection are baked, or in asset mode, whether or not the textures of that asset have been baked. That is just a check or a cross, right? And if all objects of a collection have been baked, the checkbox of the collection bake is going to be enabled as well. Same for if you bake the entire collection here in collection mode, all the assets will get that checkbox too. Now, even if you restart Blender, right, or uninstall the add-on and reinstall it later, these checkboxes will just be there, right? They will work because they look at your bake folder and export folder, okay? And that means that if you change your bake folder, if I change this now to a different folder, let's say here, there we go, and I refresh my list, there we go, refresh, they are now gone. Right? If I set it back here, go one up, accept, and we go back. If you go back and forth between collection, that is also a very nice way to repopulate your lists, right? It's just a very clean way to refresh, repopulate. You also have the button, but switching is a bit stronger. So there we go. And yeah, that will show your status of the textures, right? This will show the status of your export formats, right? And I'm saying it like that because if we collapse this and we set this to different formats, we actually have different export icons here. So while these are selected, when something is selected, you can delete your assets and that will delete them from the Assetify list, and it will also delete the processed asset, so the new asset that has been made. So remember that. Now for the collection, it's going to delete the entire collection, right? There we go. And it's also going to clean up, purge your unused data. Okay, I think otherwise it's just going to fill up your file way too much. So we need to purge. So we can process them once again, save and proceed. Here is your Volkswagen bag, and we can just select it. And we can also separate this by material or join assets. Now we can join this first because we have an actual collection with multiple objects that make up one shape, one object, right? So we can actually join all of the assets from that collection, or if you go into asset mode, you can also, for example, join the wheels and the tires, right? You can join them, and these together will be the wheels, in my opinion, right? That's what wheels are. Otherwise, they are rims, I suppose. We can just combine them to be wheels, right? And there they are, new wheels. So we can also just join the entire collection here in the collection mode, join assets. We can name this VW, Volkswagen, joined. All right, join. There we go. Now, what is going to happen is that our one object gets all the materials from all the parts, and which means that if you want to separate them again, right? Let's say you created this object as one object with different materials, but you want to bake them as separate materials for some reason. Or let's say you have the result from a geometry node setup that uses different materials and you want to separate them in an easy way. You can just separate this by material. There we go. And it's going to go through your materials to create your separated assets, right? So you can now just select each one of these here in your outliner and you can tell that they are separated materials, right? And then you can individually bake these as well if you would like, right? I'm just gonna join this up to VW joined. There we go. So now we have one object and we can actually start working with the process now, right? So we can actually start working with this object. So let's head on to bake settings, right? So in the bake settings, there is some pretty default things going on. Things you already know from rendering probably or from manually baking. The first one was a user request from the trailer a week ago. I quickly added that in. You can actually skip UV unwrapping. There is a automatic UV unwrap and packing involved in Assetify, which means that you don't really have to unwrap anymore if you would like that. But you can skip it in case you already have set up your beautiful manual perfect UV map. You can actually skip the UV unwrapping. Make sure to have it selected though in your UV map here, right? Make sure it is your active UV map, and then you can just bake it, right? Without unwrapping, okay? So enable that to skip the UV unwrap that Assetify does. Now the target platform I added 2 because I think the Unreal Engine 5 one can be used for pretty much anything, because you end up with a base color, a roughness, a metallic map, and an alpha actually as well, and a normal, right? So you get metallic and alpha included with this process, which is a bit hard to do manually. And for Unity, there is the option, because Unity uses a combined metallic roughness map, right? Which means that one of them is actually packed into the alpha channel and the other is packed in one of the RGB channels, but they are combined into one texture, okay? So that is if you want to do that for Unity. It's actually gonna bake and pack it the proper way. Now we can use tiling, or let's start with GPU, CPU actually. Choose between the two, right? What works better for your system? I use GPU mostly, but sometimes GPU rendering is a bit more unstable in general. If your VRAM gets crushed by your scene, it crashes quicker, and CPU usually, I don't know, it feels a bit more stable. But you can also use tiling for your GPU. And that means that you're just going to split it up in smaller tiles and segments that are going to be rendered, right? So you can play around with that and see what works best for your system. So by default, I would have this turned off probably and set to GPU until I have an object that's really giving me troubles. Then I will set this to CPU or tiles. A bake folder, set that to whatever you want, right? Like I said before, your export folder will match your bake folder unless you specify your export path to be something else, right? It's always nice to have your texture folder next to your formats, right? Your exported formats. So yeah, we can now just bake this, right? And remember, your bake samples do not need to be high at all for baking, because you use no direct or indirect light, just simply color, and which means usually 2 samples is plenty. Sometimes I go to 4, maximum 8, sometimes even 1, right? If I'm feeling crazy. But usually 2 works fine. So let's just render this as 1K for now. I'm just going to render it very quickly for you and see what happens and how quick it is as well. So we can just bake this, save and continue, right? Because that is important. Now, while this is processing, I'm just going to sip a little tea here, because why not? We just have to wait. That is a good tea. So it's going to bake your base color, your roughness, metallic, alpha and normal maps. It's already done. And let's go to rendered view, see how it looks. There we go. This is the actual baked result at 1K, right? One texture, one object. Let's see the textures. Oh, hello, open that up. Shader. There we go. So because we actually baked it for Unity, I already set this up to apply your textures in a way you would use the Unity as well, which means you're going to be using the alpha channel inverted for your roughness and your color red channel for the metallic value, right? I'm not sure why that is, but it is the way it is. Now, if you do this for Unreal Engine, you get the actual separated metallic and roughness maps, right? Easier. So this is what it looks like, right? Beautiful. And that is what the combined one looks like. This is the red channel. This is the inverted alpha for the roughness, right? Beautiful. So let's click on this again. There we go. And now we can just export it, right? Let's say you want to get this into Unity as an FBX or OBJ. Let's do FBX. We can just export the selected FBX collection. And we can even set this back to FBX, and you can see that this is actually dependent on the import format that you select, right? So let's set this on OBJ. There is no OBJ, we didn't export it. So this shows, nope, you don't have that. And if we set this to FBX, it shows, yes, you have that, because we just actually exported that. So we can now re-import that back in here, There we go. It's going to import it at the world origin. I thought that would be nice. So here it is, our actual FBX model with the textures we created, ready to be used in whatever, right? FBX, and we can do the same for, let's set this to STL or GLTF. There we go, export. Then we can set this to GLTF and import the GLTF. There we go, right? So we're adding them all in our scene, okay? All with different formats. If I use our shader editor, we can even see that it's imported back with the GLTF kind of shader settings, I suppose. There we go. So yeah, that is really how you use that. So let me now get to the interesting features that you may not know about. And that is the enable custom attributes and Mossify mode. What Mossify mode does, and while we're doing it, I'm going to quickly set up a beautiful sphere, and I'm going to go to Mossify, right? Mossify is an asset library that I created called Mossify, and it is a Moss asset library. It has like 9 biomes currently, and we can actually control the color of the Moss biome in the geometry nodes, right? In the geometry nodes modifier here. Let's set our density higher. And let's see, I can set my custom color here to be, for example, pink or orange or whatever. And usually this is very hard to get into your actual particles, right? Because this is controlled in your emitter instead of your particles. So let me actually enable our particles here. Let me add that to be visible here. So these are our particles. Let me scale this down a tiny bit. Right, there we go, particles. And they are now green, right? So let's say you want to bake these with the colors you actually set in your geometry nodes, right? Let's say you want to add all your custom attributes to your textures before you export this. There is a way to do that. So let's open up Assetify and let's enable Mossify mode. Now you get the option to choose an emitter. So let's enable our sphere here. And so now we can actually set our asset collection to be the high performance collection, which has the actual particles. So if we now process this with the actual Mossify mode, you have to watch these particles. What happens when we process them? Save and proceed. There we go. Back to rendered view. They are now pink, right? They get the colors we set in the geometry nodes. And you can actually now select them, go to the bake settings, set this to 512, for example, bake, save and proceed, and they will actually be baked with that color, right? And this is where that swap functionality really comes into play that I've been explaining. And that is because we can now swap these new baked assets with the procedural assets that we had before, and then we can actually start baking the entire emitter. Right, this should be done in no time while I'm talking through the process slowly. There we go. It is now done. Go back to rendered view. Now if we hit that swap button here, you can see that these are swapped by the original assets that do not have the color, and our actual new assets are now applied in our emitter. Right, you can tell by the very slight color change. And that is because when we bake, of course, we do not bake translucency right away, which means that the translucency is just lost a little bit, right? So which is fine. You can add that quite easily later. So this is the baked asset. So now we can actually disable this and set this to be our sphere emitter. Add this to a collection called sphere, right? Set sphere here. And then we can actually process that, but before we do that, we have to make sure that there is actually a material to process as well, instead of a blank material. So let's just make this pink 2. Nice. Now we can actually process this. There we go, rendered view, and this is our processed asset. Now, the case here is that I don't want to bake our entire object again, right? Reason why is because if we now bake this, right, it is one object, which means that our detailed UV maps of our particles are gonna get lost because it's gonna re-UV unwrap everything, which means the entire geometry that we see right here, right? If you don't want that, you can actually separate, right? That's where that button comes into play really nicely. We can actually separate our sphere by material, right? Separate by material. And that's gonna be separating this quite nicely. And then if we go to the asset list, when this is done, we can tell that we now have some extra assets belonging to the materials of our sphere, right? So this one is the emitter, and these are the actual particles. So for the emitter, we can now select that one, material one, in the list, and we can bake that individually, right? So that is quite easy. So if we now hit bake assets for just that first material, it's going to bake the sphere. And once that is done, we can just simply rejoin these assets, and then they will have their own UV maps, right? So select all of them, it's done, join to sphere joint. There we go. And so now we have one asset for sphere. We can go to rendered view. There we go. And it's now one object, but different materials, of course, that use the same UV map or the same. Each material has, of course, its own kind of space and mapping to the material and UV. But this means that we can actually retain that detail that we have in our actual Moss particles, right? Without having to re-UV, re-bake. So that is quite beautiful. So now we can actually just export that. So collapse this window, export settings. Let's choose FBX, export. And then we can go back to import format FBX and re-import that. And give it a sec, and then hide our game ready model. And this is our FBX, right? Very easy, very nice, and still very detailed as well. So that is why Mossify mode is important. Now for the last functionality, enable custom attributes. What does it do? Well, to show that off, I'm gonna add a quick emitter object, and there we go. Let's say you created a particle system or a scatter system in GeoNodes, right? Let's add a cone here. There we go. And let's set this object to be a geometry node setup. New. And let's say you instance on points, right? Instance on points with a join geometry here. So we keep our emitter and add the particles. And the instance I want to be a collection info. And I want this, for example. And let's also add a cylinder. Why not? Make it a bit smaller. A cylinder and a cone. Press M, new collection. Call this attributes, just for fun. And let's set the origins to be at the bottom real quick as well. Origin there and origin there. And then we can actually set this to be attributes here. And then we can separate and reset. And then we can scale them down a little bit. There we go. And pick an instance. And then we may as well just shift A, align Euler to vector, align rotation to vector, and choose the vector to be normal. And I'll attach that there. So they rotate in the normal direction. So now let's say you want an option in your geometry node setup that is able to color these attributes, these particles by a custom value set by the user in the modifier here. We can do that by hitting Shift A, store named attribute, set this to be color, and name this, for example, add color. Doesn't matter what. And then we drag this out to a group input. There we go. Now in our actual attributes there, our cone and our cylinder, we can add a new shader. Shift A, find an attribute and name this add color. The same, of course, we just stored, and connect that in here. Now let's use the same material. Let's just rename this attribute. Let's use the same one for this one, attribute there. Add color, and in here we store add color as well. Right, so we can actually use this to color the actual geometry, right? So if I set this to be pink, we're now colorizing these two objects, but only in the geometry nodes, right? Not the actual assets, which means that if I would want to bake these assets or these particles individually, right? If I would want to bake them apart from the emitter, which means that they would have their own material and their own UV map pretty much, we would have to do some manual work. And I don't like manual work, right? I want to do this automatically. And that is where, let's press N, the actual custom attributes come into play. So to make that visible, let's add a new material to our emitter. Make that like orange. yellowish, doesn't matter. There we go. And what we would want to do then is first bake, of course, our particles. So let's hit plus and select our asset collection to be our attributes. And let's enable custom attributes as well and choose the emitter to be your sphere. There we go. Now we have custom attributes that we can add here. And those attributes should match the color, for example, that we give it here, which means that it should have the same name, add color. It should have the same, what is it called, data type, which is float color. And it should have the same domain, which is point. There we go. This should already work. Now have a look here, right, at these assets. They're now black because they can't get the data from the geometry nodes. But if we process this, save and proceed, go back to rendered view, they get that actual pink color. Beautiful. So now we can actually bake that color onto the particles and use the new particles instead, right? So let's just click on the collection list. Let's hit on attributes. And let's actually delete the old one cone. I'm not sure why that's there. Attributes. We can actually bake these attributes now. 512 is fine. And let's bake them for Unreal Engine. Bake, save and proceed. Give it a few seconds. It should be quite easy. And once it is done, there we go. Beautiful. Back to rendered view. And we can actually now swap these new attributes, the baked ones, with the ones that were procedural. And if we do that, you will see this one swap back to having a black value. Swap. That means that we now use the baked versions on our geometry. And that means that we can now disable this and set this to be our sphere. So let's move this to a new collection called attribute emitter, for example. Attribute emitter. So let's process that. There we go. Attribute emitter. We can now separate this by material. And the first one, the first of the spheres, right? The first one is going to be the emitter, which we still need to bake. So we can just individually bake this one by just clicking on it, bake assets, save and proceed. Give it 3 seconds, I suppose, maybe 5. It's quite quick. And then in collection, we can join it back up and call this attributes joined. There we go. Beautiful. Now in rendered view, let's also just export that as FBX. There we go. And let's import it back as FBX. So this is now our new asset, right? And that has an actual combined materials. There's 3 materials, one for emitter and one for the cylinders and one for the cones, which means that you can get a lot of more detail in there if they will be actually detailed particles, of course. But this shows you that you can actually transfer your own custom attributes that you set in your geometry nodes of your emitter, right? So that is the last function, and that is basically it already. If you have any suggestions when you use it, any recommendations, any issues, please do let me know. I will add a Discord link below. I created a Discord so we can chat more easily, I think. The Gumroad and Blender Market links will be below as well. You can choose which other one you prefer. And yeah, enjoy Assetify. I hope it will save you a lot of time. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, if it does, you know, and then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.